Hey, everybody, welcome back to part 3 of a 5-part series on the 5 W's of intervention, of dyslexia, where we're covering everything to do with appropriate intervention and advocacy for children with dyslexia. So of all the W's, this is part 3, and we have 3 more to do. We've finished the why. Why do we have such a literacy crisis, and how is this impacting our kids with dyslexia? We've covered the what is dyslexia, and now we're at the when. When we have concerns and suspicions, but when do we identify dyslexia? We're going to start by recognizing the flags for dyslexia, and we're going to talk about early screening and intervention. And then we're going to talk about when we typically assess and the components that need to be present in a quality assessment. So I'm going to talk about all the flags by age, but as advocates, I think it's really helpful to know that from people in the field, right, the most common overlapping traits that help to tag if a student is most likely, in fact, dyslexic. The first one is pretty well known, but it's a family history, including those not officially diagnosed, since you know that the diagnosis rate is really low. But they're, that uncle or whatever that you had back in school, who we all know had trouble reading or trouble with school, right? Number 2 is going to be a history of speech impairments or a previous reason to work with an SLP. Number 3 is going to be that we have a diagnosis or suspected ADHD. All these things run very much in tandem. It's some of the things that we see most commonly when we're looking at profiles of kiddos with dyslexia. It doesn't mean that it's there necessarily, but these are just kind of flags that we see as common traits in all of them. And I'm going to share the research stats with you in this part of the presentation, but just know in the most simple form, these are some of those most common overlapping traits. So here's a list of the big picture flags. It applies to what we're generally watching for, those signs and literacy acquisition. They had trouble learning their letter names and sounds. They had trouble with decoding words in isolation, difficulty with spelling. They're non-fluent readers. They have avoidance of reading aloud or any reading in general, trouble with comprehension. But of course, that trouble with comprehension is due to that slow and choppy reading. Now we're going to break all this down by age, and it's important that we can all recognize the flags by age so that when you're speaking with parents, or you are a parent yourself, you know if there's a reason for concern. At this age in pre-K, they're pre-readers, and they don't have those reading skills to assess, but they do have emergent reading skills to look at, and those can be measured. So, of course, one of the biggest areas to focus on or flag at this age is if there's a family history. There's about a 50% pass rate between first generation. So that's why many families kind of start to watch at this age. A second reason people kind of tend to tune in at this age is because they have other kids and they notice that they weren't developing the same, right? Within reason, of course. But as a whole, they can't or they don't rhyme. Nursery rhymes are a good way to notice this since they just don't really learn those rhymes easily. They're slow to learn to speak. Again, back to that speech comment that I made a second ago. Also pronunciation issues, same thing. Low vocabulary also can be same thing. They have word retrieval issues, and they've just had trouble learning the letters in their name. Now, with all these slides, as we go up in age, recognize that the previous flags still do exist, but we're going to start to layer more items as they build more academically. Also, some of the earlier stuff may not be as noticeable, like they finally have their pronunciation down better, partly maybe because they worked with an SLP, or they do finally know the letters in their name, but it took forever to get there. In kinder, we aren't really reading yet. That expectation is very low, but we start to focus a lot more on phonemic awareness or wordplay, etc. But phonemic awareness has so much to do with dyslexia and reading that we can assess flags, and we want to assess these flags. First grade is opposite, is a huge reading growth year. So it becomes a lot easier to pinpoint as it pertains to actual reading skill. So we talk so much about phonological awareness and phonemic awareness, and these words often seem interchangeable. They are different, but they're very similar. So I wanted to break down the differences so that you knew. It all comes from the root of phono, which means sound. And for your purpose, it's important to understand that children with dyslexia tend to have trouble with all of it. But it all starts at the top with the overarching category of phonological processing, which is part of that definition of dyslexia. Phonological processing has three components, of which phonological awareness is one of them. And that's the part that we're focusing on more heavily in the pre-K through first grade group. Phonological awareness is a general awareness of the parts of a word, like the fact that they can hear syllables, they can hear that onset and rhyme, they can hear alliteration, or in other words, the same starting sound of a word, and that they have phonemic awareness, which is basically a more refined, detailed version of phonological awareness. It also includes the ability to isolate phonemes or sounds, blend, segment, and manipulate skills. So it is the more advanced skills of phonological awareness in effect. You likely are never going to need to know that, but this is the difference in the words if you've ever wondered if they can, in fact, be used interchangeably. So back to the signs. Now we're in second and third grade. As the rigor of reading increases, the problems also do. By now, they're going to know most of their letters well enough, and maybe they have some okay phonological awareness skills, especially if teachers are working on this through structured literacy curriculums. But their reading achievements are much slower than others. And we see the breakdown often at that single word level reading. We also see it in fluency and spelling. They're doing lots of guessing. They're not applying what they know from phonics instruction. But please note, many of these kids are still hanging with their neurotypical peers through memorization, and they aren't standing out significantly. So the school doesn't think there's a reason for concern. Their grades are fine. And remember, so many of our nation's kids are reading below level. So who's going to notice the difference between the kids with dyslexia? Remember that first part. But also remember when I was describing in part 2, what is dyslexia, how hard those kids are working to be able to hang with their neurotypical peers. So often parents are seeing the fallout at home. All right, so we're in 4th through 6th grade and we still haven't caught these kids. And P.S., this happens all the time. They're struggling to read aloud and they're avoiding it. They have lower vocabulary than their peers, and they struggle to comprehend what they're reading, and then just their writing is suffering as a whole. But when I speak to parents of kids at this age who want to test, or they just got a diagnosis finally, they all say, I knew something was wrong. And every year I went to the school to express my concern, and they shot me down, saying that my child was making great grades and wasn't hitting my radar. Mamas and daddies need to trust their guts. They often know their kids better than those teachers do. Those teachers have 25 plus kids, and moms and dads are the ones tuning in closer to see their emotional breakdowns when they come home. All right, so now we're in middle school, but by this age, we have tons of kids who are still struggling and not diagnosed. This list of flags is basically a compounding of all the others. All the items before still exist, but now we're just struggling as a whole to keep up. By this age, they expect you to be able to read and write like more of an adult level. We're not measuring reading levels anymore. We're reading to learn, and we're learning a lot. And the expectation of the amount of reading is very high, and writing. These kids can't keep up with the demands. And I know neurotypical middle schoolers who also can't keep up, just to kind of put it in perspective. So now I want to turn everything around to focus on early intervention and early screening before we get to formal testing. Since when we intervene early, we might not even have as much concern on actual testing in some cases. We also can intervene before the school is even before the school is even eligible to test. So let's break down the steps by age. So technically, a neuropsychologist can correctly identify dyslexia at age 5.5, but you likely only have enough reason to be concerned if there's a family history. But no, it can happen. The first point at which we screen to formally place a child in any level of a net is at the end of kindergarten, because we can prove the gap isn't due to a lack of educational exposure. But early intervention is best executed when we start even earlier than that, pre-K and even the start of kinder. We screen again at mid first grade, but we can also technically test at this age through the school, since the rule is either that kid has turned 7 or they've hit mid first grade, whichever one comes first. The problem is the school tends to not even consider testing until third or on, earliest mid-second. So by then they've failed several times and likely even gone through a round of RTI. But many would argue that this is too late for lots of reasons. Now, it doesn't mean it really is too late, but it comes with several negatives. So this seems tricky, right? Give a pill for something before we've even tested for the sickness. What this shows is that the first folks for whom it's essential to have certified and structured literacy are our pre-K through first grade teachers, and they need to have quality structured literacy curriculums in place that are supported by administration. Now, the ideal early intervention window to overcoming dyslexia is pre-K through first. So it has to be timely and there has to be lots of onion layers, right? I always say parents need to be chirpy hawks at this age, always watching, always asking questions. So let's talk about dyslexia screening through our schools. Although we've known for at least 20 years the importance of early identification for our children with dyslexia, it's a lot of hotbed research that's been focused on lately. And this is due to the fact that we have more and more concrete research on the fact that early and appropriate intervention means overcoming or preventing dyslexia. But we must be using scientifically based, proven intervention. I know many of you have heard that term, overcoming dyslexia. So let me explain. A child will always have dyslexia technically, but we can overcome the language-based struggles of dyslexia through early and appropriate intervention. That's why we call it overcoming dyslexia and not curing dyslexia. The point of why it's so important to intervene early is because we need to get in there when the brain's plasticity is at its highest. The chance of rewiring the brain and overcoming dyslexia is so much higher. Currently, 80% of our US states have early screening legislation, but typically they're allowing school districts to select their screener batteries. We need more oversight and reform to this, since the quality of the screener chosen can greatly impact who we're flagging. Here's some evidence through MRIs and research to prove that these brain differences can be seen prior to formal reading instruction. What we need is for the schools to more widely accept that we can see learning differences, often cases before or at birth. This is not just from environmental circumstances or lack of education. Of course, schools don't have MRIs for all their students, but we can't wait for them to fail. Instead, we need to appropriately screen and intervene early. This is so much more concrete than they realize. And a lot of this was stolen from different elements of presentations by Nadine Gabb on early ID. She's a powerhouse in this industry. Brain alterations can be seen before kindergarten that predate formal reading instruction. And if we intervene early, we don't see the noticeable gap in their, they don't see, excuse me, the noticeable gap in their reading abilities compared to others. And they would eliminate so many kids with that social impact of dyslexia later on, and cost and all kinds of stuff. There's a term we frequently use in this community called the dyslexia paradox. We know that we can see reading struggles in dyslexia early. In many cases, it predates formal reading instruction. In fact, the ideal window for intervention, like you've heard me saying, is pre-K through mid-first, those most crucial reading years. since the brain's neuroplasticity is at its highest. But if the schools have adopted a more of a wait to fail approach, where we don't formally test until mid-second grade earliest, but we're behind the 8 ball at this point. In fact, Joe Torgerson shows us that in his studies, between 56 and 92% of at-risk children achieved average reading ability if they received that effective and intensive reading instruction early on. If we replace the wait to fail model with the support model, it means we screen them early before we've even formally tested them. And we identify those at risk, use effective evidence-based curriculums, and catch them. The only ones who are left are a much smaller percentage that need to be referred to special education. And in my opinion, if we could ensure structured literacy training for all pre-K through first or second grade teachers and place that high quality curriculum in their hands and teach this to the entire class, not just intervention kids, this would help solve this. And of course, my first part really reinforces of this presentation really helps to reinforce all those thoughts. So I want to go a little deeper into dyslexia screeners and dispel their associated myths and explain how they are different from a diagnosis. A screener is not a diagnosis. It only tells you the likelihood or the probability that a child has or will come up dyslexic. So since early screening is so important, let's look at the common myths. Right now, only 10 states do not have legislation requiring early screening. Number 1, I've already dispelled. Number 2, screening's not expensive. It's free in most cases. And as long as we're using an approved universal screener, that it's highly impactful in our net, right? Catching those kids early. Number 3, it's not going to add more testing. Screening takes as little as 20 minutes in many cases, and it's done by the classroom teacher. Number 4, most kinder teachers didn't screen until it became law. And we need reform on these screeners in schools. The schools use very often the teachers are not reporting their findings to parents. Parents don't even know that the kid was flagged. And I personally am one of those people. I had to ask. Number 5, the idea is to intervene early so that they're not referred to special education later on. But this has to be effective, intensive, and appropriate. And I'll cover that more later. Number 6, a screener is not a diagnosis, but more of waving a red flag. Number 7, ELL kids can be screened in their native language since dyslexia shows up in all languages. Number 8, effective intervention does exist. It just needs to be trained on and utilized in the schools. Number 9, they're not going to outgrow dyslexia, which I've already dispelled. And number 10, screeners are designed to be implemented by classroom teachers. So these are some huge bullet points. It takes 4 times longer to intervene in 4th grade than in late kindergarten. Children at risk for reading failure can be reliably identified even before kindergarten by assessing their emergent literacy skills. I've already mentioned, but this one is the biggest guy. With early identification and prevention programs, the number of children who are placed in special education can be reduced up to 70% longer. And it costs 2 times more to serve a student in special education than in general education. I'm sure you guys all know that. When the state is budgeting, there is one amount that gets put on the head, dollar amount gets put on the head of a gen ed kid, and there's a completely different amount that gets put on the head of a special ed kid, and it's usually at least double. So while this is true, this is when completed through a neuropsychologist, right? School age testing can't occur until a kiddo is 7 or mid 1st grade, whichever one comes first. My 6.5-year-old was just tested because it was December of his 1st grade year, and because I'm a bulldog. So here's an example of how dyslexia or language-based learning difficulties can happen to anyone, despite your household education levels or your knowledge about dyslexia. It's an equal opportunity offender, right? This is my child, Beck. He is currently in 1st grade, but our journey started mid-kinder. February of last year at his parent-teacher conference, excuse me, I was presented with his mid-year Dibbles report. He was classified as in the well below benchmark or needs most support group. So bottom. He was at the bottom. But I wasn't surprised because speech issues run highly in tandem with language-based learning disabilities, as I've told you, and dyslexia. And Beck has been in speech since he was 18 months old for articulation and expressive language. His receptive has always been off the charts. Also, he has ADHD. He has had all the flags except for a family history. And he had all the pre-K flags too, but he's the 5th child and I run a business and shame on me. So as a parent, of course, I wanted to know the teacher's plan. So I asked her, she must be concerned, right? She said that he would not be receiving any extra support since there are many more in the class who were much worse. And honestly, remember I mentioned before that many times parents don't know the results of that screener. I think it's because there are so many kids that come up really low that they want to do some damage control and give it a little bit more time first. That is my true thought as to why that happens. So of course I jumped in since the school wasn't going to, but not everybody has the seamless ability to do this like I do, but I know how critical it is to his trajectory. So he worked after school for 60 minutes, 3 times a week on the following areas using evidence-based curriculum called BUILD that was created by the Texas Scottish Rite Hospital for Children. He worked with one of my therapists. An early intervention program like this works on reading in a developmentally appropriate way. So here's a side-by-side comparison of his kinder mid-year Dibbles and his beginning of first Dibbles. After 5 months of intervention, 3 times a week, he had enormous growth. And this isn't actually apples to apples since Dibbles requirements will grow with age and grade level, and he still had met goal. In fact, at the beginning of his 1st grade year, he was considered to be one of the top readers in his class. So as of now, Beck has worked with one of my therapists for a total of 10 months. He was, like I said, just tested for dyslexia, and he didn't qualify. All of his subtests did show a decent gap, but not enough to qualify. But I would bet lots of money that without this intervention that we had done, he would have qualified because up at that point, he had done 10 months of intervention. So he's completed BUILD. But I still decided to continue into traditional dyslexia therapy because he qualified under dysgraphia. So I hope that everything that I've taught you drives home the point that we should never agree to wait to test if they're of age. Do not just wait to give them more time to develop, right? Since this really means we're just waiting for them to fail. RTI and a complete evaluation can happen concurrently. It does not have to be consecutive. And we have this crucial time window. And the US DOE feels so strongly about it, they even issued a guidance letter about this. So remember back to one of our first slides in the first section of this 5-part presentation. 74% of poor readers in 1st grade will remain poor readers in 9th grade unless they receive direct explicit instruction and phonemic awareness, or just really as a whole. Okay, so we have a kid who's 7 years old or mid-1st grade, and we've had adequate educational exposure, and they still fail their screener. It's time to test. So let's start by breaking down the differences between the types of formal tests that exist. To test for dyslexia, I would always prefer a comprehensive exam, meaning a full neuropsych or that FIE through the school, since this is what I call testing and showing the landscape of the child's brain. Dyslexia often doesn't stand alone. So that is one reason. But I also want to know more about the kiddo's G's, like how their brain works. Now, there's such thing as a standalone dyslexia determination. And that also has its place in the world. This is more like what happens when the kid is tested under Section 504. It's more limited. It is not comprehensive. That means we only test for dyslexia. So it's like looking only for dyslexia. It's only isolating one of the mountaintops in that kid's landscape of the child's brain. Some states improperly, in my opinion, qualify dyslexia under Section 504. So that's all you're going to get. Or you can seek this type of private eval for an opener when the school refuses to test, like, seek it on your own. So I'm glad that these tests do exist. But I mean, my company even does these, but I would prefer to see the whole shebang. Lastly, in the formal testing umbrella, there's such thing as formal baseline testing, so norm reference baseline testing. And this should be used at the start of dyslexia therapy. I like to say it's like finding the geo coordinates to reach the top of that kiddo's mountaintop. And then annually, we want to repeat it so that we make sure that we're still on the right track and we're seeing that neural growth. So it's key critical to understand that dyslexia profiles can vary significantly, and the entire child needs to be taken into account. It shows up in a spectrum of severities. It also has many comorbid disorders and intellectual deficits it likes to hang out with. So as therapists, interventionists, and advocates, it's important we understand the whole child's profile, not just that mountaintop, so that we can properly adjust therapy to serve their specific needs. Okay, so this is, again, why I'd prefer it to be a full FIE or a neuropsych, so I can see all of this. When we're testing for dyslexia, we want to make sure that all of these areas are included in the test to be able to appropriately identify if dyslexia is in fact present. I read reports that I don't always see all of these areas pulled in. So that could be one of the reasons that they're not qualifying, right? So the primary qualifying areas are word reading, word attack, decoding, reading fluency, oral reading, and then spelling. We need to show that they have the ability to learn in the absence of print, so that we're looking at their listening comp, math comp, fluid reasoning, verbal knowledge, nonverbal knowledge, oral expression, oral comp. And then of course, we're going to tune into those secondary consequences like comprehension, both on the word and the reading level, vocab. And then look at their cognitive abilities, right? Possible contributing factors to all of it. And by the way, phonological processing, RAND, these are all, I'm going to tell you, are big, high qualifiers, or phonemic awareness. All right. So here's some of the assessment batteries that are common in the diagnosis of dyslexia. The most important piece to remember is that we're no longer supposed to use intelligence as a factor in the diagnosis. This was part of the old Dysgraphia, which used IQ as the primary qualifier in weighting the weaknesses. So this is wrong for many reasons, such as not allowing children with lower or higher IQs just in all areas of intelligence. Also, we know there's several racial and socioeconomic biases in those IQ tests, which was making our diagnosis rate too low. Dyslexia infrequently occurs on its own. 40 to 60% have comorbid disorders. So let's dive deeper into that. Here's some of the most common ones that we see. As therapists, we want to know if something is also existing, like dysgraphia, auditory processing disorder, expressive receptive language disorders, ADHD, or anxiety, so that we can adjust and layer the programming that we choose as a therapist. ADHD, they'll tell you that when we have standalone ADHD or anxiety, it's a flag to seek comprehensive testing, since it'll tell you something else is co-occurring. And then, of course, if we have anxiety, we need to look for what the antecedent to is of that anxiety, because it is not all genetic. So the primary focus of this presentation is dyslexia, but many of our kids can have comorbid dysgraphia. It's not uncommon. Dysgraphia can stand alone. In fact, it does with 2 of my children. But I wanted to show where they are similar and where they are different. The main component areas of dysgraphia are 1, fine motor, I do think that this area is a little too over-focused when it comes to dysgraphia, but it is in fact a part of it. 2, that they have spelling trouble, and 3, executive function pertaining to writing. Those are the 3 main areas that are impacted with dysgraphia. Now, all of these areas are addressed in dyslexia therapy. But when we have a kid with a comorbid diagnosis of dysgraphia, we need to make adjustments to therapy to go deeper in these areas and add on component lessons for the executive function. We need to go deeper into that fine motor, go deeper into spelling, that many more repetitions. Once we've, but then, add on more at the end for written expression once we've developed enough language skills. But what the 2 have in common: poor spelling and punctuation. Written work doesn't reflect their ability or knowledge. They're avoiding writing. And then, of course, messy handwriting. Especially as our kids with dysgraphia get older, I feel the executive function piece is the most challenging for our kids with dysgraphia. The rest can be adapted a lot through assistive technology. But taking your thoughts and translating them onto paper in an organized and cohesive fashion is very challenging for these kids. This graphic helps you to understand the why behind that. We need to get all this down on paper, and the working memory is a really big blockage to that. So this is Joan Sedita, if you're wondering. Also extremely important to know are the intellectual deficits commonly co-occurring, such as a low RAN, low processing speed, or low working memory. Intellectual deficits have nothing to do with intelligence, but more the speed or ability with which the brain can retrieve the information. We adjust our therapeutic delivery for these things, since these impact how well they ingest the material. These are just some reasons why it's important that you don't just serve kids with something like an out-of-the-box programming. And I read tests all day long, and both phonemic awareness and RAN are huge indicators of dyslexia and are commonly seen as some of the weaker areas. RAN stands for rapid automatized naming, and it deals with retrieval speed from long-term memory. It has a high predictive power to the strength of reading for obvious reasons. But telling a child with lower RAN to just keep working on it is akin to telling a short child who cannot reach the higher shelves that typical children can reach to just keep reaching more, as though repeating reaching will enable a short child's arms and legs to grow longer. Rather, in both the short child and the child with the low RAN, accommodations are what is ethically appropriate. Give that short child a step stool and the low RAN child more time. As the expert, you can guide both parents and teachers towards what are more appropriate accommodations and beneficial uses of the child's time and effort. But extended time must be on there for these kids. Slow processing speed is also very commonly weak in these kiddos, and it's an area that we have to adjust our therapeutic delivery for. So there's a reason many people with dyslexia work at the CIA, the FBI, NASA, and technology firms. Dyslexia is not an intelligence problem. In fact, most people with dyslexia have average to above average IQs. Once upon a time, a discrepancy between IQ and reading level was used to diagnose children as having dyslexia. If a IQ and could not read as well as his peers, just raised the flag and he'd be identified as dyslexic. The children with lower IQs would not normally be diagnosed. Today, that idea is changing due to the use of brain scans and imaging in the study of dyslexia. According to research, children with lower IQs who also struggle with reading have the same brain or similar brain scans during a reading task as those children with higher IQs who are labeled as having dyslexia. Because of this, we've begun to eliminate using IQ for identifying dyslexia, and we give intensive intervention to both groups. Additionally, kids with ID, intellectual disabilities, or IQs in the borderline range, and those with IQs in the moderate range can learn basic reading skills given consistent, explicit, and comprehensive reading instruction across an extended period of time. It's important to note that the rate of improvement for these students with lower IQ is usually a lot slower. My company, we serve multiple kids with ID, and it's been beautiful to see the progress they've made, but recognize it is going to be much slower. In the same way that kids with ID can have dyslexia, so can gifted kids. It's often a testing professional's first reaction to notice all the scores in the average range or above average range, even, and not diagnose dyslexia. But gifted kids are the master of all compensators and can be struggling with the same things. So this slide is its own point, but really helps to back up the last slide we just looked at. The composite score is less to focus on than the sub-test scores, since the composite is just an average and the devil's really in the details. The sub-test scores can really help us guide on prescriptive instruction to create intervention that's suited for them. But this really backs up my last slide about 2E kids, since this is a 2E report. And I placed her IQ at the top of the slide to put things in perspective, not to say that we use her IQ as a determination on whether she or not she's dyslexic, but this was in fact her strength. And all of her G's were in a similar range, but this report didn't show them in a chart to be able to like easily screenshot. If you look, all of her composite and subtest scores were in the average or above average range. So you wouldn't think that she'd even qualify right on first glance. But if we use her full scale IQ as her strength, this is a 39-point gap between her weakness and pseudo words. Her PA was actually an 88, so it was a bit lower, but I couldn't visually capture it in the slide to show. But even looking at just that 39 points is a 2.6 standard deviation gap with those pseudo words. All right, so let's look at testing models. So once upon a time, we used the discrepancy model. This started with IDEA wording back in 1975. We trucked on till about 2004 with the reauthorization of IDEA, where it said that you could use the discrepancy model, but you could also now use other models. A 2011 study conducted under the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, the NICHH, CHD, concluded that the discrepancy model is not a valid basis for allocating special education services in reading. Regardless of IQ, all children with dyslexia should be eligible for support in reading, learning to read. This research, along with the IDEA regulations and an increased demand for diagnosing dyslexia rather than more generic specific learning disabilities, came out, and the RTI model was then developed as a way to start to net these kids. But this was supposed to be using research-based programming, although we know that they're not. Because of the flaws in the discrepancy model, the pattern of strengths and weaknesses, or the PSW, was developed. The main difference between discrepancy model and patterns of strengths and weaknesses is that the full scale IQ is not a focus unless an intellectual disability is suspected, and most likely the cause of the learning problems. The PSW model utilizes a cognitive evaluation to measure a student's performance on a range of areas, such as memory, processing speed, and phonemic awareness. But many folks just call the patterns of strengths and weaknesses, or the PSW model, the discrepancy model 2.0, since it also relies a lot on cognitive tests and still calls for a large gap between ability and performance. Many would like to see the schools access the kind of tests that neuropsychologists do, assessing a child's capacity for and speed at many of the components that make up successful reading, focusing on such skills as a child's ability to recognize sight words, sound out nonsense words, and to read under time conditions and spell words correctly in their writing. The Texas Dyslexia Handbook and the revamp, the revision for 2024 that they're voting on now even refers to this as a pattern of evidence in order to sway schools towards this kind of more of this approach. But Despite all this information, a 2018 study showed about 1/3 of school psychologists were still using the discrepancy model for diagnosis. So as we move towards the end of this section, I wanted to stick in some key critical items that I hear in my practice on a regular basis from parents fighting the system. Even in some states with the strongest dyslexia legislation like Arkansas, they tell me that the schools aren't allowed to diagnose dyslexia, only dyslexic tendencies, or just generically call it an SLD in reading, or say that it's a medical condition and therefore they can't diagnose. But here's the problem. I believe wholeheartedly that if they don't use the word dyslexia, then parents can't point to the copious amounts of research out there that show specifically how to intervene for dyslexia. And since the schools aren't equipped to serve the kids, it's easier for them not to name it in the IEP. But newsflash, schools can diagnose and are encouraged to by the Department of Education to name dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia in the IEP. Schools need their feet held to the fire on this one. There's an October 23rd, 2015 Dear Colleague letter from the Office of Special Education Programs that clearly states this. And this is my last slide, and it's a bit of a random comment, but it seemed best addressed in this place. We do not recommend a child with dyslexia be retained. If a child was not instructed in the manner that it needed the first time, why would you think that round 2 would be beneficial? If I don't speak Spanish and you speak louder to me, I still can't speak Spanish. We need appropriate instruction they need appropriate instruction in the way their brains need it. And retaining them is only going to screw up their self-concept. Bless me. As all of their peers keep going and they stay in that same grade. Their brains have the ability to understand the grade level information. They just can't do a seamless job of decoding and encoding it. Promoting them and giving them the tools and appropriate support to help them be successful is what we need to do. And if the school does choose to retain them, well, obviously that's a parent decision also, but they better be testing those kids. All right, so that was the last slide in part 3 of our 5-part series of the 5 W's for dyslexia. Our next part is going to be answering the who. Who provides quality support, appropriate intervention, progress monitoring, and accommodations for dyslexia. Thank you guys so much for joining.